Morning and welcome to our second in series of seed webinars, Cultivation of Trickier Crops, with Katrina from Golden Organic Heritage Seed Library. We're really thrilled to have her with us today to do this live webinar. Just a few housekeeping rules. As it is a webinar, we can't see or hear you. We know you're there, but we can't see or hear you. If you have any questions during the webinar, please do submit those in the Q&A box. And if you struggle to use the Q&A box, just pop it in the chat box and I can pick it up. That's no problem. We are recording this session, so you can go back and look at it on the Cymru Knowledge Hub. If you missed a bit or just want to recap, it will be available there. Just give us a few days to get it up on the site. We can put details and the link in the chat for that. If you do get kicked off the webinar for any reason, unpredictable Wi-Fi, children, whatever, you can join back on using exactly the same link. There's no change, you just rejoin us and it won't interrupt, you'll just rejoin the webinar. Just to give you a quick overview of the project, I'm sure some of you have seen what Cymru do before, but we are here to support commercial growers in Wales through 100% funding, training and business development. So we have lots and lots of events coming up, online events. If you have a look on our Cymru website, you'll see what's happening and what's coming up in the future. And of course, you can always drop us a line as well. We're always happy to speak to grower businesses. So I think that covers it. I'll hand over to Katrina. As I say, any questions, pop them in the Q&A or the chat box and we'll pick them up as we go through. So thank you. Over to you, Katrina. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alice. Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining me on this second session. Welcome back to those of you who joined me on the first session. And no worries if you weren't able to join the first session, I'll be recapping some of the basic principles that we covered then. So just to give you a bit of context, we're on webinar 2. We've already looked at some of the basic principles for seed production, and we looked and applied those to what we would consider some of the easier crops for cultivation for seed. This morning we're going to be moving on and building on that knowledge and looking at some of the trickier crops that we consider for seed production. And then we will move on to webinar 3 of a feature day at the end of this month, looking a little bit more detail in the selection process for crop cultivation for seed. Now we've got quite a lot to get through, quite ambitious content for this webinar this time, and as Alice said, please don't be shy about posting questions as we go along. I will be pointing you to additional resources at the end of the session, including to the Tyfu website where this will be available for review once it's been recorded. But you can follow along, and obviously I'll be happy to answer any questions. Alice will jump in with some questions, and I will do my best to answer them as we go along. So a quick botany recap, and I suppose from seed production, for quality seed production, which is what you're going to be aiming for as a commercial seed producer, we're really looking at 3 things. One is bearing in mind that we are dealing with open pollinated seed, not F1 hybrids or anything else, which does mean that those varieties will breed true to type from one generation to another, and that the seed will contain the genetic information of the parent plants. It also means that those plants are highly variable, and we'll be talking about what that means for seed production and the kind of judgments and considerations you need to be making along the way as you produce that seed. We also consider the lifespan in terms of seed production, and essentially we're talking about either annual seed production, so seed that's produced in a single growing season, biennial seed production where the plants flower and set seed in the second year, or perennial seed varieties. And we talked about the fact that generally for seed production we deal either really with annuals or deal with perennials as annuals or biennials for seed production. And what that means in terms of the kind of interventions you need to put in place in your crop rotation plans, etc. And then we look at the flower types and the pollination methods, and we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. We talked predominantly about perfect flowers in the first session, and so something typically like your peas, like your peas or your runner beans, pea flowers being perfect and happy self-pollinators, so hence some of the easier crops. We'll be looking at the trickier crops such as the runner beans and the broad beans, which will happily cross-pollinate. And we also considered plants that have separate male and female flowers, so in this case the squash plants, and the kind of interventions you need in order to be able to pollinate and produce seed from them. And we also considered less common examples, but in this case separate male and female plants with separate male and female flowers. And in this case, a wind-pollinated variety for spinach. So we'll be taking all of these into consideration and thinking about what we need to do for seed production. So we'll be looking specifically at annual cross-pollinators first of all, and then we'll be looking at biennial seed production, which takes a great deal of commitment. Like I say, we've got a lot to get through this morning, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to at least introduce the key principles for biennial seed production. As I mentioned in the first session, and this is something that I will continue to reiterate through all of these webinars, there are two simple rules in terms of seed production. We are trying to firstly prevent cross-pollination, and secondly remove any undesirable individuals along the way. What I mean by that is only save seed from the very best examples of those varieties. And of course, for you as potential commercial seed producers or even potential breeders of varieties further down the line, this is a significant area for quality control. I think it's worth spending a few minutes on trying to identify the issues you have with cross-pollination, because as I mentioned with open pollinated varieties, they are all genetically variable. So each plant is going to be genetically slightly different from another plant, even within the same variety. And really your experience is going to come into play to understand whether the variability you're seeing in plants in front of you, or even the seed that is produced, is the result of either cross-pollination, which is something you're going to try and prevent, one of those key principles, or an example of slight variability that you will want to remove along the way. It's not an exact science, and perhaps the best way to sort of illustrate this is to talk through an example, a classic example of cross-pollination. And for us, that is the wonky squash situation, of which we have huge amounts of experience at the Heritage Seed Library, and squashes are some of the varieties that we often have a great deal of trouble maintaining as true to type. Particularly this rather depressing wheelbarrow full of 1 year's harvest of one variety type, which is clearly cross-pollinated. The important thing to bear in mind is cross-pollination is expressed in the next generation, in this case, in this particular harvest. And often it's you can see it as a visible variation either in flower, fruit, or seed shape and colour. And really it's helpful to understand what has gone wrong. What is it that you're seeing in front of you, and when has that has happened? Are you looking at evidence of cross-pollination, or is something else going on? So the original seed, let's talk through this particular journey for this squash variety. So this original seed is the seed you've sown. It's consistent as you expect. It's the kind of size and seed that you would expect to have for this variety. You grow it throughout the year. It produces lovely, consistent harvest of squashes that you're expecting for that particular variety. The seed within it is a consistent seed shape and quantity that you would expect for that variety. However, by the time you grow it, the time you grow it out, there clearly is some significant variation. And it's an understanding that the seed coat for that particular seed is determined by the parent plant, but the embryo within that seed is the result of what's happened in that year's growing season to produce that particular fruit. And clearly we go back to, as we mentioned in the first session, it's about what's happening at this stage, at the flowering stage for pollination to produce that future generation of seed. In this case for the squash, clearly what had happened at some point was the pollen from another variety, the male producing flower from another variety had been transferred, probably by insect, to that female flower within the variety that you're saving the seed from. So we're going to be talking about some of the interventions that you will need to put in place. We'll be looking specifically at what that means for a number of vegetable types. We'll be going through some of the classic traditional vegetable crops. And what I've tried to do is include vegetable types in this session that I'm aware that you as growers are either already growing or have indicated that you're interested in growing as a potential commercial seed producer. So often cross-pollination evidence appears in the seed itself, and for us very often we only discover that something has cross-pollinated, remember, in the previous generation when we actually pod for our harvest. So here's some examples for you to think about. We've got about a dozen black-seeded runner bean heritage varieties in our collection, and one of the things that we always do on harvesting is obviously inspect the seed. This is a classic example of a black-seeded runner bean where we've got some variation in there. What we're always asking the question of, bearing in mind that for a black-seeded runner bean, for example, the difference between a black coat and a speckled coat is a very small change in genetic information. We're having to make the judgment about whether what we're seeing is just a typical genetic wobble that we find in open pollinated seed, or is evidence of cross-pollination that's occurred in the previous generation. Generally, our threshold is somewhere between 5 and 10%. So for this petri dish on the left here, we would significantly suspect that cross-pollination had occurred in the previous generation. Similarly, in the central here for broad beans, this is a single crop harvest of seed. Clearly the seed is all over the place in terms of seed coat colour, shape, size, etc. And it may well be that we would not have noticed any particular difference in the growth habit or the flowering habit of that plant during its growing period. And it's only really when we've harvested the seed that we can see that some kind of cross-pollination has occurred. That's typically the case where vegetable types have very similar characteristics. Long green runner bean or a long green broad bean with black and white flowers, for example. The picture on the right, just really to illustrate that we're also trying to make a judgment on whether that variability is as a result of just a natural genetic difference between these open pollinated varieties. The picture itself is not particularly clear, but I hope you can see that there is some difference in the seed coat colours. So this is a French bean. They don't typically cross-pollinate. It's one of the crop varieties that we discussed, crop types that we discussed in the first webinar. And that's because they're generally pretty stable and they don't regularly cross-pollinate. But you can see here that the typical seed coat, as we understand it to be for this variety, is brown with a kind of purple fleck. But you can see that there are other seed coats here which are inversions of that. So they are purple seed coats with a brown fleck on it. That's quite common with open pollinated varieties for French bean types. And we would certainly tolerate that level of it. In fact, it might well be a well-known feature of that variety. But if we weren't expecting that, and that's where we need to know a lot about the varieties that we're growing, we may well consider that low risk of cross-pollination has occurred. In session 3, we'll be looking a lot more closely at selection processes and how we rogue out examples that are not typical. But we may well happily tolerate that difference in seed coat colour for something like a French bean. And cross-pollination evidence can be quite subtle. I'm talking about evidence after the event, so after a previous generation where the cross-pollination occurred. But for you as seed sowers, it's always worth inspecting the seed before you sow it. Our judgment, I think, would be on this broad bean variety is that although there is some variation, from the first glance we would pretty much tolerate the slight difference in seed coat colour, slight difference in seed shape and size. But in fact, when we turn these on their side, we can see that there's a great deal of difference of the elan colour, which is a considerate marker for cross-pollination in broad beans. And this is something that we did apply we did do a review of a number of broad bean varieties in our collection and retrospectively discovered that many of them had actually cross-pollinated based on this marker alone. again, it can be quite subtle and it's difficult to pick up. So the question I would ask you to consider as potential commercial seed growers, how are you going to buffer against these kinds of issues? Obviously, for us as a heritage seed library, we're very much focused on maintaining a heritage variety as true to type. We do not want to discover that we've got a cross-pollinated variety. And one of the key insurance policies that we use is that we maintain multiple generations of seed for exactly that purpose. You could have a crop loss due to poor weather conditions or pests and diseases, or you could encounter cross-pollination. So for us, we always maintain the original seed if it's been donated to us, just purely for reference purposes, but then we always maintain at least 3 latest generations of seed for each of our varieties. That's a kind of capacity that you need to think about whether you want to introduce. It may well be that you're buying seed in from a seed supplier initially, and you feel that that's low risk because you can easily resource. But if you are maintaining your own seed stocks, you need to factor this into your management of risk for seed production. So what can we do about this? Well, isolation is the key method that we use for all of our crops, and we'll be looking specifically what that means for each vegetable type that we come across under this category of trickier crops. For us, our typical growing space at the Heritage Seed Library are polytunnels. It might not be very clear that we have mesh doors either end, so they're completely sealed. So for a cross-pollinating vegetable type, we'll be discussing examples such as runner beans, broad beans and squashes, we will only ever be growing one of those types in one of our polytunnels. For the easier crops, such as peas, tomatoes, French beans, we might have multiple varieties growing in a single polytunnel. That might not be a practical consideration for you, for your growing spaces or the scale on which you're planning to grow, but growing under mesh covers and isolation cages outside are perhaps another option you might want to consider. This is something that we adapted ourselves, so this is a large fruit cage. This is around 4 metres wide by 10 metres long. We've covered it with fine grade mesh, and that growing space will accommodate a single brassica variety, biennial brassica variety that we're growing for seed. Just a quick note on mesh sizes. Obviously, from your perspective, you might only be considering keeping off the obvious cross-pollinating insects like bees. You might want to keep pests off, such as cabbage white butterfly. And there are different mesh grades for you to consider. We tend to go for the finest mesh grade because we also want to try and prevent things like whitefly, and particularly in long crops like biennials when you're really growing them for more than 1 year. So as a general rule, our mesh size that we use is 0.22 millimetres by 0.8 millimetres, or you can obviously use a quarter grade mesh in order to do that. We put this together, we sewed this together and use it and slid it over the cage with sort of door sleeves, etc. on it. You may well want to adapt something on a much smaller scale, such as this here. Of course, there are other options, and depending on where you're located, isolation may well be much easier for you. The practicalities of producing a structure to grow in might not be for you, but you also must bear in mind if you are in an isolated area, it may well be that you're also in an agricultural area, and we'll be looking at some of the isolation requirements for things like broad beans, which will cross readily with field beans, which are commonly grown, for example. Or you may actually have some really useful structures like hedges or woodlands that divide you from other growing areas. Of course, if you're going to isolate your crops, then the other consideration you need to make is how are you going to replicate the pollination methods needed to produce those seeds. And we'll look at what those mean for some specific examples. But for us at the Heritage Seed Library, the key thing that we do is hand pollinate a huge proportion of our crops. It's incredibly time consuming, so you will need to consider whether you have the resources and the work hours to be able to put into hand pollination. And we'll be looking at specific examples, but you can see here that we hand pollinate our winter beans, we hand pollinate cucurbits such as squashes, but we also introduce pollinators. And the image in the centre here is of white fishing maggots that pupate into blowflies, which we introduce into our polytunnels and our isolation cages to pollinate some of the crops that are much harder to hand pollinate, and we'll be talking through some examples of those. So all things that you need to factor in terms of setting up your infrastructure for seed production for some of these trickier crops. So let's crack on with some specific examples, and I'm hoping some of these basic principles will make more sense when you're looking at some of the crops that you're personally interested in growing. Again, I'm going to keep repeating the same two principles. What you're trying to prevent, very relevant to these crop types, is you're trying to prevent cross-pollination, and secondly, you are making sure that you're only saving seed from the very best examples. And that means that throughout the growing process, you need to apply a process of selection and removal of those undesirable examples, making a judgment all the time about whether what you're seeing in front of you is evidence of open pollination variation within a particular variety, or evidence of cross-pollination. And it's important that you are able to spot that throughout the growing year to make sure that you make the best use of your growing spaces and your valuable growing time to produce a good seed yield. So let's look at some specific examples, which I hope will help you in a little bit more detail. I know some of you are growing runner beans or planning to grow runner beans next year. Very easy to grow in terms of food production, but certainly one of the trickier crops we consider for seed production because they are such prolific cross-pollinators. So runner beans, most runner beans are going to be tall, climbing types, but there are dwarf varieties and what we call half runners who put out sort of long shoots from a bushy growing habit. Obviously, you need to factor that in terms of the growing structures that you'll be using to support them. There are different types with different flower colours and different seed coats. And again, if you're growing to maintain that particular variety for whatever feature that variety has, this is where prevention of cross-pollination is really going to fit in. We grow in polytunnels. They really don't like the heat that polytunnels produce. So you may well consider growing them in isolation outside, or you can apply mesh covers to individual flower trusses, but that is quite time consuming, and you may well be better off isolating the entire crop under some kind of mesh isolation. So for us at the Heritage Seed Library, we grow these on these kinds of structures. The varieties are outbreeders. They will happily cross-pollinate, and bees absolutely love visiting them. So we need to consider first of all the population size, which we would have at around 20 to 30 plants, but also need to isolate them as well. If you're ever concerned whether you've actually got a runner bean seed in your hand or a French bean seed, if you're not quite sure, unlike French beans, the runner beans are hypergeal, so you will see that the cotyledons remain under the soil level before the true leaves emerge, unlike French beans where the cotyledons will be apparent. So if you ever receive some seed and you're not quite sure what it is, that is how you can test that when you're growing it. In terms of isolation, you might find a wigwam structure is much more suitable for meshing off your entire variety. And generally, we grow in this form in a 4 metre by 1.5 metre space. That's usually enough for 20 or 30 plants to give you some idea if you're not too sure. As I mentioned before, we hand pollinate because we isolate them from pollinators. Flies are not big enough to pollinate these plants. The flowers themselves, although outbreeders will happily self-pollinate, but they do need to be tripped to set seed. So what we do is mimic what would normally be a bee in the UK by accessing each of the flowers, pressing down the keel of the flower and using a very fine paintbrush to transfer the pollen. This is a huge task. It takes several weeks because for many runner bean varieties, they will succession flower over some period of time. So you really do need to commit yourself to hand pollinating across all of these 30 plants to produce the seed. Now, I mentioned that we treat runner beans as annuals. Technically speaking, they're perennials. That's kind of good news for a seed saver, because that is a kind of insurance backup. So if, for example, during your growing season, you suddenly discover that within 800 to 1,000 metres, you have another runner bean variety being grown by a neighbouring grower, of course, the high risk is that the pollinated flowers on your crop that year will have cross-pollinated with the neighbouring variety. Because they're perennial, you are able to actually cut these down to the ground, and you can overwinter the roots and replant them if you think that risk has occurred. Similarly, if you have a particularly poor incident with pests and diseases, they are susceptible to frost, for example. And we discovered, because they are so sensitive to heat in our polytunnels, we've had some real problems with them dropping flowers at critical points during the pod production part of the year, that we've been able to overwinter the roots. The tubers, they are highly toxic, just bear that in mind, but you can dig them up, select them, plant them out the next year, and you are able to grow them again for seed. Of course, you may find that your growing year has been fine, but by the time you get to podding season, the podding stage, you're running out of time in terms of them to mature and produce seed to this kind of dry level which you need by the end of the growing year. One of the things that we do to increase the yield on our growing is to top them at the top of the canes, if that's the structure you're growing on, and also to remove any pods, small pods that have started to form towards the end of the growing year. You really want these plants to put as much energy into producing pods for seed production. So broadbean, very similar to runner beans in terms of the cross-pollination risk. Again, they need a long growing season. I didn't mention it for runner beans, but typically we want to grow these out for as long as possible. We're growing them way beyond the stage that you would harvest them to eat. So we generally start sowing from about the end of March onwards to ensure that we've got as long a season as possible. Obviously, for us growing under cover, that's less of an issue. You may need to factor in your growing season and the length of your typical growing season outdoors in order to accommodate this. Again, they are highly promiscuous. Bees absolutely love them, and they will happily cross-pollinate. So we also indicate a similar distance of around 800 to 1,000 metres. As they're outbreeders, same as runner beans, the more plants you can grow, the better. We suggest a minimum of around 24 plants. If you aren't able to isolate them in the same way, you aren't able to mesh cover them, and you think that they may be field beans growing nearby, one of the things you can grow is grow them in blocks. And we can grow them in blocks of around 36, but you can only save the 4 seeds from the 4 plants in the middle. So again, in terms of how you're growing these, are you growing them for seed, are you growing them for product as well? Are you able to save the seed from plants that you're growing for food production? This is one of the ways that you can do both of these things, but obviously yield will be much lower if you're only saving seed from just 4 plants. You can't really isolate them in the same way as you can for runner beans, so you can't bag up the flower trusses in the same way as you might choose to do for runner beans. The structure of the plants just makes that impossible, and they don't like it. So you do actually need to cage them in some way or isolate them by distance. We're just harvesting them now. So after peas, which is usually our first harvest for seed, we start bringing in the broad beans. You can see, if you haven't grown broad beans for seed before, actually the harvest stage is quite late on, and the pods themselves will have turned very dark brown, often completely black. They do look pretty ropey, but that is the best stage in which to harvest them from seed. We don't have a great deal of time to talk about pests and diseases generally, but I think it's really worth introducing the issue that we have with broad beans in particular, and that's bean weevil. You may see evidence of bean or pea weevil on all sorts of crops, and that's often by a telltale nibbling of the leaves themselves. But very often, for us, the emergence of bean weevils is a particular issue with our broad bean varieties. So one of the key things that I would recommend for you to do, and obviously what you're aiming for, is a quality seed harvest. The last thing you want to be doing, either as a direct seed merchant or a contracted seed producer, is to be producing seed that is wholly by the end of your harvest year. Is that we would always freeze broad bean seed. So we take our harvest, obviously it needs to be dry, because if you freeze something that has a high moisture level in it, those frozen crystals will actually damage the structure of the seed. But for broad beans, if you harvest them at a dry stage, and usually that's very evident, you can't really press your nail into the surface of the seed coat, and if you're happy to leave them to dry for a few more days, you can put them in the freezer for 7 days. What this does is kill off anything that may still be contained within the seed. As for you as a seed grower, all is not lost if you find you've got a whole set of holy seeds. Often the bean weevil is really eating through the cotyledon. The only issue you have is it's actually eating through the embryo part of the seed itself. That will make it unviable. But you can keep that seed, you can resow that seed, and hopefully you can generate a new harvest which you can then freeze to overcome any of these problems. We're going to look at cucurbits. I mean, this is a massive area of cultivation, so really we can't cover all of the details of every type of squash. The good news is, realistically, for seed production, you don't really need to do that. I'll talk briefly also about seed production for melon and cucumbers, but if we focus initially on squash for the next few minutes, I think that's something that you need to bear in mind. Is we talk generally about summer squash, including courgettes. Often they're eaten at a very immature stage, and we often contrast them with what we call winter squashes, and those are ones that have perhaps a longer storage life, a harder outer fruit coat, and will last longer. The good news is, and I could go through all of the different squash types, which I'm not going to do now, but in terms of seed production, we treat them all the same. So we are going to be growing them all the way through their natural mature stage of that plant. And for summer squashes and even winter squashes, that often is way beyond the usual stage that you would pick for eating as a food product. As I mentioned with our walkthrough classic wonky squash example, squashes are quite difficult to isolate, just in the same way as runner beans and broad beans are, and that's primarily because insects love visiting the flowers once they're opened. In terms of producing seed from squashes, you're going to be growing them just as you would for growing for food. So you're going to be taking the same considerations in terms of spacing. Is it a bush habit variety, or is it a training variety, and adequately space them in exactly the same way. You're going to be protecting them from spring and autumn frosts with fleece if you're not growing them in a polytunnel. And you're going to be growing as many plants as possible for seed production. Now, squashes will cross-pollinate, but they also require a much smaller population in order to ensure a healthy gene pool. So although we're talking 20-30 plants for runner beans and broad beans, you can easily get away with 6 squash plants for seed production. And in fact, if you were really pushed, 1 or 2 plants, these varieties will happily be pollinated without a significant risk of inbreeding depression. But of course, you are dealing with open pollinated varieties. You are going to be selecting out any examples that are not typical. You're only going to be saving seed from the very best examples. So we would always recommend a population of at least 6 plants in order to do that. And you're in the same way as the fruit is maturing, and even more so because you're going to be growing on a much longer growing season than you would perhaps to eat it. You're going to be lifting those fruits as they develop off the ground. Generally, depending on the size, we might use bricks or upturned plant pots, etc., to ensure that you don't introduce any particular issues. In terms of pests and diseases, crumpled or yellow mottling on the leaves may indicate something like cucumber mosaic virus. You need to remove that pretty sharpish. That can be seed-borne, so you need to watch that quite closely in order to manage that as a healthy crop and seed-producing population. As we talked briefly at the botany recap, squash plants are monoecious, so they have separate male and female flowers on each plant. So the process of pollination is by hand for us at the Heritage Seed Library. Again, for you, if you're growing in complete isolation, that might not be such an issue. You might be able to allow them to naturally pollinate using insects. But for us and for the method of hand pollination, there are a number of methods to use. But I think the best method is to identify the male and female flowers on the plants. Often that's best to do that at the end of the day. You want to be looking for flowers that haven't yet opened and are not yet too mature. So you need to identify which is male and female while they're closed, and generally the female plants will have a more of a swelling behind the flower itself. Obviously that's an indicator of the fruit that it's going to produce. You want to keep these flowers closed. You don't want them opening first thing the next morning. You can masking tape them if you're growing them outside, and mark where they are so that you can easily revisit them first thing in the morning, and transfer the male pollen by taking off the male flower itself and transferring that pollen onto the female flowers. You want to open those flowers very briefly and then reseal them again. Obviously, in order to ensure a good gene pool, we recommend that you transfer male flowers from different plants to different plants with female flowers. To make sure that you do that, you can actually introduce more than one male flower to one female flower in order to increase that genetic biodiversity within that variety, and then produce the squash from that. Cucumbers and melons, they're a lot harder to hand pollinate, and I think you need to accommodate perhaps a lower success rate. So they tend to reject about 70% of hand pollination attempts. So you might have to multiple attempt to do that. With something like a melon, you're going to be harvesting the seed when the fruit is at a mature stage for eating. You will actually get more seed, up to 10% more seed from a melon that you have grown and over ripened. But realistically, given the effort in growing them, you may want to actually enjoy the fruit as well. So you have to sort of level that up, that payoff. And for cucumbers, you want to keep them on the vine for as long as possible. Way beyond the stage that you would ever consider eating them. Typically, very often they will go yellow, they may go soft, or they may actually have a hard outer coating. And then you really want to leave them aside after you pick them for at least a couple of weeks. Exactly the same with the squashes, to continue to mature before you harvest the seed from them. And be warned, a very squishy, rotten cucumber has a remarkably poor smell. So you may want to make sure you store that somewhere appropriate. I'm going to mention sweet corn briefly, and that's because I understand at least one of you is growing or is planning to grow sweet corn or maize for seed production. And this is the one wind-pollinated variety that we're going to consider initially as one of the trickier crops. Interestingly, we've only got two heritage sweet corn varieties in our collection. One is an actual variety, an heirloom variety that produces white maize seed. And the other is in fact a population, which is not a single variety, it's a combination of different varieties that's traditionally associated with this rainbow sweet Inca variety that we have in our collection. Either way, you still need to isolate them from cross-pollinating from another variety. You don't want to introduce the standard sweet corn pollen into this particular variety, even though it is of variable colour. And similarly, you want to isolate in the same way a single variety. This one, unfortunately, here is some evidence that it had already previously cross-pollinated. There are some yellow seeds within what should be a white seed cob, and you have to jump back a couple of generations in order to rectify that. As with squashes, they have separate male and female flowers, beg your pardon. The male pollen-producing flower is the tassel at the top, and the female pollen-receptive flowers are the ones that will obviously produce the cobs themselves, and they have these sticky pollen-receptive silks on each of the flowers. Wind pollinated, and that will apply to a whole range of crops, mean that the pollen itself is extremely fine and will travel a very long way, unlike insect pollinated, insect attracting pollen. And that is reflected in the isolation distance you need to maintain these varieties as true to type. We're talking somewhere between 1 and 3 kilometres at least for something like this, and that applies to other wind pollinated crops like spinach and beetroot, for example. So the method to manage that that we'll be looking at, and something that we've applied ourselves, is to isolate the individual female flowers. Now this is an image that I took while I was on a field visit to a testing station in Spain, and it was quite encouraging to us because we had to figure this out ourselves when we were isolating one of our sweet corns we were growing that year. Essentially what you need to do is bag up the female flowers, the silk, this sticky silk pollen receptive flowers themselves. There'll be a difference in when the pollen is produced by the male flowers, and you have to account for that as well. And you can try and time isolate. So you can try, if you're staggering 2 different sweet corn varieties, you can try and ensure that there's a 2-week gap between female flowering on each of the varieties. But realistically, I don't think that's very practical. You do need to have a particular intervention, especially if you know that sweet corn is being grown, or maize is being grown in neighbouring fields, is to cover them up. Paper bags, I think they used in a slightly drier environment. We have invested in some purpose produced mesh bags, fine mesh bags, in order to protect the female flowers. We then collect the pollen from the male tassels in a paper bag, and we take a paintbrush and we hand pollinate the female tassels several times over to ensure best pollination of each of those silks that we possibly can. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to keep going through some of these. Alice, did you have any questions that you wanted to bring in?
I just have one question before
I'm conscious I'm rattling through this, so please fire away.
It's a question from Maxwell about squash. After you have hand pollinated a squash flower, how long does the flower need to be sealed until a chance visit won't make any difference?
Oh, that's a really good question. We're quite risk averse, so as soon as you see that the fruit is starting to form, eventually the petals themselves will simply fall off. So I would say, if you want to be sure that pollination has occurred, if it hasn't occurred successfully, the flower petals are going to fall off anyway, and you won't result in a fruit. So I would keep them closed really until that fruit has formed and those petals will fall off. And naturally, obviously, you need to bear that in mind. One of the things I didn't mention, which I think might be important, is that you do need to mark which fruits you've done that to, because of course you might not have noticed another fruit flower opening. You might not have intervened in that way, and you might not have hand pollinated, and therefore it might go on to produce a fruit and drop its petals in exactly the same way. And you might not be aware, therefore, that cross-pollination has occurred. So you do have to be quite focused on watching the flowering phase for that. I mean, to be honest, that's why we grow them under cover rather than try and use that method and that's why we grow them in a sealed polytunnel. But my suggestion was just keep them closed, and the fruit will start to form with a successful pollination, and those petals will drop.
There's just another question before we move on quickly from James. How long do I leave the cobs on with the corn, or can I dry off the plant?
Oh, again, very good question. So we found it's a bit of a balance because of the long growing season required, and because we're growing them outside, we're also susceptible to changes in the weather. So obviously we don't want to keep those on there for long enough for them to have issues with mold and significant frosts, if they can, air frosts, if that's going to be an issue. But for us, actually, one of the issues we had to contend with was growing interest from rodents that as these were drying out. We want them as dry as possible. So I would say if you can keep, bearing all of those factors in mind, if you can keep them on there, we are looking at harvesting the seed when you can feel that it's visibly hard on the outside of the seed coat, but we do green them inside to do that. So it is a bit of, I'm being vague here because it is a bit of a payoff between your local growing conditions and poor weather. But once those ripened seeds have, when you pick them to eat, I would say it's too soon. You want to keep them growing for much longer than that, until the foliage itself of the plant is starting to die back. If you can't wait that long, then by all means bring them inside. We have some large glass houses which we lay them out, space them out carefully in order for them to dry out further. We even take off the outer foliage in order to do that, to make sure that we're not introducing pests and diseases or building up any kind of mold issues within the seed itself. But the final seed, as I'm sure you know, is going to be a very hard seed. So the longer you can keep it on there, the better possible.
Great, thank you.
Okay, are you happy for me to continue?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, hang on. Oh, sorry, follow up to a question from James.
Don't worry. Yeah, sure, carry on.
Very quickly.
That's okay, that's fine.
Also, population size for corn, I've heard should be more than 100.
Oh, I didn't mention it, did I? Well spotted, James. Thank you very much for picking me up on that. You're absolutely right. We grow at least 100. So again, in terms of size commitment, you are talking quite a large population size. And that's because you are going to lose some along the way. You are going to have to select out because there will be some variation within that open populated variety. And because you do need a good genetic gene pool in order to maintain that variety true to type as an outbreeder. I'm not sure if I mentioned specifically, you do want to transfer the pollen between that population as well. So you're going to be transferring the pollen from the petals to the female flowers on different plants as well, if that wasn't obvious, in order to benefit from that transfer of pollen. But yeah, 100. So I think at the start of this session, I showed that 4 metre by 10 metre fruit cage that we use for our brassicas. That's the kind of footprint we're talking about for 100, a population of 100. Obviously, you can produce more than that, even better. The more the better, but we go for a minimum of 100, assuming that we're going to lose down to around 90 or something like that throughout the growing season, if that helps.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we're clear to move on now. Thank you.
Okay, great stuff. So we're flying through these. So I'm looking at radish in front of us at the moment as an annual brassica. You can have biennials and overwintering radish, but I'm going to talk specifically about these because these are quite a good crop to grow for seed. They do produce reasonably good quantities of seed, but they will cross-pollinate, and as a brassica, the flowers are self-incompatible. So kind of another angle to come into some of the things that you need to consider, and a good example of something that you need to consider in terms of population size and pollination method. So these annual radishes generally, as the pictures show, you'll be talking about these sort of round root, white root versions, or even sometimes these kind of rat tail versions where you actually eat the seed pod. That's the eatable part of a particular variety of annual radish. The flowers themselves are self-incompatible. The more plants you grow, the better as outbreeders. And we would suggest a minimum of 15 to 20 plants in order to ensure a reasonably healthy genetic pool of seed. Obviously, the more the better that you can, and they don't take up a huge amount of space. The important thing to bear in mind is that because those flowers are self-incompatible, the pollination process is something that you need to consider. They are very small flowers, so unlike squash, where it's very visible and you can easily transfer, move pollen about, even though these are perfect flowers, you're going to have to somehow move the pollen from one flower to a different flower. Now, for us, this is where the introduction of the white blowfly maggots comes into play, and you need to factor in the run-up time for those maggots to pupate and emerge as flies. So you need to be looking at the flowering phase on your annual radish, accounting for a 2 to 3 week run-in to when you need to introduce pollinators to do that. We have hand pollinated when we have had to bridge the gap between when our blowflies are about to emerge and the flowers have already emerged. That is very time consuming indeed. Again, we still use this very small paintbrush and we transfer pollen across flowers. But if you're familiar with radish flowers, they're extremely plentiful and quite small. So again, I would certainly recommend that you introduce pollinators for them instead. As brassicas, as outbreeders, again, we are talking quite a significant isolation distance of at least 1,000 metres, and you need to sort of factor that in to your planning and your labour availability for seed production in that year. Certainly, one of the things that we've had to learn the hard way is, unlike some of the seeds that we've just been talking about, the previous crop types, a radish seed is very similar across different varieties, and we're having a right pig of a time at the moment trying to unpick what appears to be cross-pollinated seed, but actually we think is just contaminated seed from 2 or 3 varieties that we grew in the same year a couple of years ago. So one of the things you do need to bear in mind is if you're growing more than one radish type, is even if you have got the isolation distances in place, or even if you've got the isolation methods in place, you have to be really careful about your harvesting method so that you don't muddle up what are very similar looking seed, often for different varieties. Okay, I'm looking at the clock, and we have got only a few minutes to introduce the concept of biennials. Please, yes, sorry, Alex, carry on.
Another question coming
Sure.
from James. I've read many different contradicting population sizes for brassicas, from 15 to 20 up to 80. Don't want to lose vigor, but obviously 80 would take up a lot of space.
It would take up a lot of space, and I've picked radish as a brassica example because as an annual, firstly as a potential annual grow, and also because the population is quite small. But you're absolutely right, James. Brassicas generally require a very large population size. Going back to that adaptive fruit cage right back at the beginning, we would stick in 100 cabbages into that cage, and we would not grow fewer than 100 cabbages as a general rule, and that's generally across most brassicas. Because they are outbreeders, because they are highly variable, and because you're likely to be selecting out, remember going back to those 2 principles, once you've managed preventing cross-pollination, you are going to be removing those examples that are not typical of that variety that you're trying to maintain for seed, and you will lose them along the way. We would not plant out less than 100 biennial brassicas such as cabbages. You can get away with less with with radish. But yes, you're right, the more the better. And when we do go on to biennials, I know I'm going to introduce this briefly now, we would say that these biennial brassicas are the trickiest crops to save for seed, for all sorts of reasons which I will cover, but also because of the population size. You have to think really seriously about crop sizes for brassicas. I'm going to briefly cover kale because I think one of you may be covering, maybe growing kale. I don't know if that is you, James, but that might give you some indication of the kind of things that you need to bear in mind for growing brassicas in particular. I hope that helps. I will point you to the end, James, and everyone else, to the seed saving guidelines, which will have for each crop type population size required, which I hope will help with some of this as well. Thank you, Alice. I will continue unless there's another question, Alice, so feel free to jump in if there is. So in the final few minutes, and this is a massive topic to cover, and it is why we'll be looking at it in a lot more detail in webinar 3, where we'll be looking at selection throughout crop types, but looking particularly, this applies to biennials. So forgive me that this is going to be a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully this will give you a taster into things that you need to consider. So first of all, biennials. So this means that you are going to be growing crops that will flower and set seed in the second year. Obviously, by its very nature, means that you're going to be committed to 2 years growing cultivation for seed. There will be multiple stages along this process: selection, overwintering. There will be different crop rotation requirements. You may need to introduce growing structures and different spacing requirements, and you need to accommodate this in your growing spaces planned. There'll be a longer exposure to pests and diseases, so there's a lot more work involved in growing biennials. I'm not trying to put you off, but you do need to be aware of the commitment required to grow some of these crops. And the seed zones to the final harvest, you're going to be talking about different population sizes in the first year into the second year. So I'm going to give you some quick examples, bearing in mind that the clock is ticking down. And I'm going to talk very briefly about the typical examples that we grow as biennials, and that's carrots, beetroots, onions, leeks, and I'll also briefly mention kale. Carrots, in terms of population size, obviously less of an issue when you're growing carrots than when you're growing cabbages, perhaps. We would sow at least 100 carrot seeds, because at the end of this, we want to end up with at least 20 to 30 good examples of a carrot variety that will be growing on for seed the following year, in the second year. Pretty much the same for beetroot, and similarly for onions and leeks, we're talking a similar kind of population, maybe more like 30 plants if you can for leeks and onions. And so what you are going to be doing is growing as normal in the first year, but actually for carrots and beetroot, lifting those roots, making that selection down from those 100 roots down to 20 or 30 roots. And ideally you want to be overwintering at least 40, because you may well lose a few over the winter process. You'll be taking them out of the ground. You will be overwintering them out of the ground generally. You can pop them up, but very often we layer them between kind of moist media such as spent compost or even damp sand, and you're going to be maintaining them over the winter months away from pests and diseases and rodents in order to plant them out the next year. For onions, you take them out of the ground completely, and again we keep them in cardboard boxes in cool, dry conditions. And for leeks, you're going to leave them in the ground, but essentially you want to make sure that you have a large enough population that you can rogue out and lose some along the way. For kale, we talked about a high population, but I'm talking around 100 for kale at least for those. You're going to be growing them 1 metre apart, so that you have a chance to rogue out those varieties, and you want to keep as many of the typical varieties growing as you can. Bare minimum of 16 to 20 plants, but as I just said, brassicas, the more the better. They'll be highly variable and you'll have much better quality seed the larger the population that you can do. After you've overwintered them, in the second year, that is when they're going to produce flowers and set seed. So anything that has flowered in its first year for a biennial, you're going to be roguing out. You don't want anything that's essentially bolted in its first year, and that applies to carrots, onions, beetroot, etc. And you want to be carefully cultivating them in the second year. Planting them out, spacing them out slightly differently. You want wider spacing for the second year, but you may only need a smaller growing space. So I'm looking at the beetroot in the middle here. In our first year, we would have probably grown in a bed that may be 4 meters long. By the second year, because we're only planting out 20 or so bulbs that we've overwintered, you're going to need a much smaller growing space in order to do that. And that's something that you need to factor in for each of the vegetable types that you're considering. Flowers are going to require pollinating. You can hand pollinate the carrots and onions, alliums using large paintbrushes. But again, we introduce pollinators, the white maggots for blowflies, and with wind pollinated crops like these beetroot, a general shake every now and again will ensure that they will pollinate sufficiently. I'm very conscious that I have, and to mention the kale again, apologies, if you're growing the kale, again, you're going to be introducing pollinators, just like the radish. The flowers are self-incompatible. You need to transfer that pollen from one flower to another, ideally on a different plant. And again, we would be introducing pollinators in order to do that, to produce those long Leek pods that dry out and that you then harvest for your kale. Now, apologies, I know I'm very conscious that I've whistled through the biennial section of this crop cultivation webinar. We will be looking at more detail at some of this in the third webinar, so I will cover this in a little bit more detail. But I hope at least it has given you a taster of what is actually involved in seed production from some of our trickier crops into our 2-year commitment for biennial seed growing. So at that point, I'm going to stop now and direct you to our Garden Organic website, where the growing advice and tab will take you through to the seed saving guidelines for each of these crops. They will cover things, as Jane asked, about population size, pollination methods, and when to harvest, and give you a bit more detail on that. And of course, this session itself is being recorded by Tyfu Cymru, and my colleagues will be able to send you the links out when this is available for you to review this. So I'll take a breath in and ask Alice if there are any other questions at this point, and thank you for listening otherwise.
Oh, thank you, Katrina. There's no further questions. If anybody's got a question, I suggest you type very quickly. But thank you very much. There's a huge amount of information in there.
There was indeed. So thank you for hanging on to that information, everyone. Appreciate it's a lot to take in.
But it's, as you say, it is recorded. So if anybody wants to go back and recap, it will be on the Tyfu Cymru Knowledge Hub. And of course, we can send out the link when that's uploaded onto the website. So useful to have that tool there. So I don't think we've got any other questions. Thank you very much, Katrina. The next webinar, the third in the series, which is selection of crops for seeds, is running at the same time on Friday the 31st of July. So we hope to see some of you again there. But thank you very much. There is, when you leave the webinar, there is a short evaluation form. It will literally take you hopefully about a minute to do, and if you could do that, that would be really useful. It's just useful for us to shape future delivery for commercial growers in Wales. But thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Katrina. See you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.